Okay, so today we're tackling something huge, the India-EU Free Trade Agreement. You've probably heard bits and pieces about it, but we're going to look at it from a totally different angle. Forget the political headlines for a second. What if we looked at this whole thing like the biggest, most complex procurement deal you've ever seen? Let's dive in.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll get our heads around this new way of thinking. Then, we'll dive into the actual rules of the negotiation, because they're not what you think. We'll look at what each side really wants, see how it actually impacts real-world industries, explore why this is so much more than a normal deal, and wrap up with some really powerful lessons in strategic patience.
All right, first things first. The whole idea here is to flip the script. Instead of thinking about diplomats and presidents, I want you to picture two giant companies, one buyer, one supplier, hammering out a contract that's going to last for, like, decades.
So what's the difference? I mean, a deal's a deal, right? Well, not exactly. In your typical corporate sourcing deal, you're haggling over every last cent, the unit price. But here, it's all about market access. You're not signing a quick one-year contract, you're setting the rules of the game for generations. And it's way less about just cutting costs and way more about a massive question: who's holding all the risk? So you might be wondering, how on earth do you even start negotiating something this massive? It's not like you can just send out a request for a quote, an RFQ, and just pick the lowest bidder. No way. The rules of engagement here are on a completely different planet. The best way to think about it in procurement terms is something called portfolio sourcing, married with a framework agreement. Sounds technical, I know, but stick with me. It just means you're not buying one thing, you're negotiating everything at once: cars, drugs, data, you name it, all to build this giant, stable rulebook that's going to govern how they trade for years and years to come.
And the actual process, oh man, it is painstaking. This isn't one big meeting in a fancy room. We're talking years of negotiations, round after round after round. You've got teams literally mapping out, okay, if we give a little on this sector, can we gain a huge advantage over here? Instead of price lists, they're swapping these complex tariff schedules. And a massive, massive part of the deal is just getting both sides to agree on each other's regulations and standards.
All right, so who's the buyer and who's the supplier in this whole thing? Well, that's where it gets really fascinating. Let's dig into the logic each side is bringing to the table, and we'll start with India.
So if you look at India through this procurement lens, it's acting like a really smart, risk-averse buyer. It's trying to lock in its own supply chain, right? It wants guaranteed access for its exports. That's basically demand certainty. But at the same time, it's putting up walls to protect its own local industries from getting swamped by competition. It even wants to make sure its skilled professionals can go work in the EU. See? It's all about long-term stability, not just getting the cheapest price today.
Now flip it around. The EU, it's negotiating like a really sophisticated, high-end supplier. Sure, it wants better payment terms. In this case, lower tariffs on its big-ticket items like cars and wine. But honestly, what it really cares about are the terms and conditions. It's all about governance and compliance. It's demanding super strong intellectual property rules, hitting hard on sustainability and labor standards, and pushing for access to India's huge government contracts. Okay, I know this can all sound a little abstract. Tariffs, regulations, blah, blah, blah. So let's bring this down to earth. Let's look at how these negotiations actually impact specific industries and maybe even products you use every single day. Let's kick things off with cars. It's a perfect example. European car makers are absolutely desperate to get a bigger piece of India's enormous market. But India has these really high tariffs in place to protect its own homegrown manufacturers, like Tata Motors. This is a classic head-to-head battle over market access. And here is the lesson for any sourcing team out there. A tariff isn't just another cost you can try to negotiate away with your parts supplier. It's a structural cost. It's baked into the DNA of your business model. And the only way you can change it is through a massive deal like this FTA. It literally changes the entire financial landscape of doing business. Okay, next up, pharmaceuticals. India is often called the pharmacy of the world for a reason. It is a gigantic supplier of generic medicines to Europe. So this negotiation, it's not just about the price per pill. It's about something much deeper: trust and standards. For a company like Sun Pharma, getting the European Medicines Agency to sign off on its manufacturing standards, well, that's priceless. It's everything. In this case, your market access completely depends on regulatory alignment. It doesn't matter how cheap your product is. If your compliance isn't accepted, you're dead in the water. Your cost advantage means absolutely nothing. And for our last example, let's talk textiles.
Indian exporters, of course, they want duty-free access for all their clothes and fabrics. But European buyers are coming to the table with a whole new set of demands, and they're all about incredibly high environmental and social standards. And this is a game changer. For an exporter, say like Arvin Limited, sustainability isn't just some feel-good marketing slogan you slap on a label anymore. No, it's now a hard, non-negotiable sourcing requirement. If you can't prove your supply chain is clean, transparent, and meets these tough ESG standards, you don't even get a seat at the table. It's a deal breaker.
Okay, so we've got our buyer and our supplier. We've seen the real-world stakes. But now we have to talk about where this whole procurement analogy gets, well, really interesting. And frankly, where it starts to get complicated in a way that shows you what these megadeals are really all about.
Which leads us to the big question, right? After all this, is an FTA just a really, really, really big corporate deal? The answer is a hard no. And the reason why is crucial.
This table just lays it out perfectly. In a normal corporate deal, your leverage is volume. I'll buy 1 million units, give me a discount. In an FTA, your leverage is strategic interdependence. It's the fact that you both desperately need each other for different reasons. You're not just negotiating a single contract for one product, you're negotiating the entire future of your whole economy. But here's the biggest difference, the real mind bender. In a corporate deal, you have a buyer and a seller. In an FTA, both India and the EU are the buyer and the seller at the same time, trading away something in cars to get something in pharmaceuticals. It's this incredible complexity that brings us to our final section. I mean, these negotiations have been dragging on for more than a decade. Why on earth does it take so long? The answer, my friends, is all about understanding what we can call strategic patience. Okay, let's really unpack this. First, the switching costs of a bad trade deal are just astronomical. You can't just fire your supplier next year if you don't like the terms. Any mistake you make now is locked in for decades, and it's almost impossible to reverse. Then you have all these powerful industries back home, the stakeholders, who will fight tooth and nail against any change that hurts them. So in that kind of environment, getting the governance, the rules, absolutely perfect is way more important than just getting it done fast. Patience here isn't a sign of weakness. It's one of your most powerful negotiation tools. So what are the big lessons we can pull from all this? First, the most important deals are almost never really about the price. Real value, that gets unlocked when you're willing to make trade-offs across totally different categories. And here's a huge one. Getting all your stakeholders on the same page internally, that's what actually decides if you win or lose. Governance isn't just boring paperwork. It's a weapon in your negotiation toolkit. And at the end of the day, you have to be willing to play the long game, because long-term value will always, always trump a short-term win.
And that really brings us home to the core idea of this whole explainer. When you're playing at this kind of strategic scale, procurement completely changes its meaning. It stops being about cost and volume. It becomes a much bigger game of securing access, writing the rules, and balancing massive systemic risk.
You know, looking at a huge trade deal through this new lens, it kind of leaves us with one last fascinating thought. If we can break down something this complicated using a procurement mindset, what other global problems, I'm talking about huge things like climate change or global public health, could we understand better and maybe, just maybe, get closer to solving if we just started thinking like a strategic buyer and a strategic seller?